Did you know there's a real historical record of a Viking and samurai encounter in 1019? Viking pirates arrived on the shores of Japan and encountered samurai warriors. The outcome of this confrontation will surprise you and may reveal which of these two legendary warrior classes would truly prevail in an epic battle. Today, we'll delve deep into the history, combat techniques, weaponry, and mindset of these two warrior groups who forever marked human history. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what time you're watching. Now let's find out together who would truly emerge victorious in this legendary battle. To truly understand who would win between the Vikings and the samurai, we must first understand the origins and historical context of each group. The Vikings emerged from Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th centuries, a time known as the Viking Age. These Norse warriors were not simply savage raiders as they are often portrayed in popular culture. They were skilled explorers, cunning traders, and remarkably adaptable warriors who sailed uncharted oceans, established trade routes stretching from Greenland to Constantinople, and founded settlements that endured for centuries. Viking society was based on a complex social structure where honor and reputation determined an individual's status. A Viking earned respect through his prowess in battle, his skill as a navigator, or his ability to lead successful expeditions. Death in combat was considered the most honorable way to depart this life, guaranteeing a place in Valhalla, Odin's Hall of the Glorious Dead. This mentality created warriors who did not fear death, but embraced it as part of their destiny. The samurai, on the other hand, emerged in Japan during the Heian period, between the 9th and 12th centuries, although their origins can be traced back centuries. Initially, they were a class of mounted warriors who served the great landowners and the imperial aristocracy. Over time, the samurai evolved to become Japan's dominant warrior class, developing a strict code of conduct known as Bushido, or the Way of the Warrior. Bushido emphasized virtues such as loyalty, honor, courage, righteousness, respect, honesty, and self-control. Unlike the Vikings, who often fought for personal glory and wealth, the samurai were motivated primarily by loyalty to their feudal lord and the preservation of family honor. Seppuku, or ritual suicide, was preferable to dishonor, demonstrating the extent to which these warriors valued their reputation. When we analyze training and preparation for battle, we find fascinating differences between these two warrior cultures. Vikings began their warrior training at a young age, but in a more practical and less formalized manner than the samurai. Viking boys learned to wield weapons through games and competitions, gradually progressing to participating in trading expeditions, and eventually in actual raids. Viking training emphasized adaptability and survival in adverse conditions, whether navigating stormy seas or fighting in unfamiliar terrain. Viking fitness was developed through the daily activities of their maritime society, rowing long distances, carrying heavy equipment, and working on ships developed extraordinary functional strength. They also practiced wrestling, running, swimming, and strength exercises that prepared them for hand-to-hand combat. Viking culture celebrated brute physical strength, but also valued cunning and strategy. Samurai training, in contrast, was highly structured and formal. From childhood, a future samurai was educated not only in the martial arts, but also in literature, calligraphy, mathematics, and other intellectual disciplines. The concept of bunburyodo, or the way of the pen and sword, required a samurai to be both a skilled warrior and a cultivated scholar. This holistic training produced warriors who were both technically superior and mentally disciplined. Samurai martial arts included kenjutsu, swordsmanship, kyujutsu, archery, sojutsu, spearmanship, and jujutsu, unarmed combat. Each of these disciplines was practiced with almost religious dedication, with masters passing down secret techniques to select students through generations. Samurai training emphasized precision, perfect technique, and harmony between mind, body, and spirit. Now let's examine each group's weaponry and equipment, crucial aspects that would determine the outcome of any confrontation. Viking weapons were designed for versatility and brutal effectiveness. The typical Viking sword was between 70 and 90 centimeters long, with a double-edged blade forged from high-quality steel. These swords were often decorated with runes and had their own names, considered precious possessions passed down from father to son. The Viking forging technique produced flexible yet durable blades, capable of cutting and piercing with equal effectiveness. Besides swords, the Vikings wielded an impressive array of other weapons. The Viking war axe, or skeggaks, was particularly feared, capable of cutting through armor and shields with devastating force. Viking spears, called geir, ranged from light throwing weapons to heavy spears for close combat. The Viking bow, though less sophisticated than the Asian composite bow, was effective in combat and hunting. The Viking round shield, made of wood with metal reinforcements, was both a defensive and offensive tool. Experienced Vikings could use their shields to deflect attacks, disarm opponents, and even as a blunt weapon. The shield wall formation, or skjaldborg, transformed a group of individual Vikings into a cohesive and formidable military unit. Samurai weaponry represented the pinnacle of Japanese metallurgy and craftsmanship. The katana, the samurai's signature curved sword, is often considered one of the most perfect bladed weapons ever created. Forged through a complex process that involved folding and refolding the steel thousands of times, the katana combined a flexible core with an extremely hard and sharp edge. This construction allowed the sword to cut with surgical precision, while maintaining sufficient strength to prevent shattering upon impact. Samurai also carried the wakizashi, a shorter sword used for close combat, and the seppuku ritual. Together, the katana and wakizashi formed the daisho, the pair of swords that symbolized samurai status. The tanto, an even shorter dagger, completed the samurai's arsenal of blades. The samurai bow, or yumi, was a work of art in itself, made of bamboo and laminated wood. This asymmetrical bow could fire arrows with lethal accuracy over impressive distances. The Kyudo school of archery emphasized not only accuracy, but also perfect form and mental concentration. An experienced samurai archer could fire arrows rapidly while mounted on horseback, a skill that was essential in feudal Japanese warfare. The naginata, a curved-bladed spear, was another favorite weapon of the samurai, especially effective against enemy cavalry. This weapon allowed the wielder to maintain distance while delivering devastating slashing blows. Weighted chains, or kusarigama, offered unique tactical options, allowing for disarming opponents or attacking from unexpected angles. Armor is another crucial aspect to consider in our comparison. Typical Viking armor consisted of chainmail, called brynja, made of interlocking iron rings. This armor offered excellent protection against cuts while maintaining flexibility of movement. Over the chainmail, some Vikings wore metal plates or hardened leather for additional protection. The Viking helmet, contrary to popular belief, rarely had horns, typically being conical with protection for the nose and sometimes the cheeks. Viking armor was designed for practicality and mobility. Vikings needed to be able to fight on ships, where excessive weight could be fatal if dropped into the water. They also needed armor that allowed rapid movement and wouldn't restrict their actions during prolonged combat. The simplicity of Viking armor was, paradoxically, one of its greatest strengths. Samurai armor, known as yoroi in early periods and tosegusoku in later periods, represented the pinnacle of medieval body protection. Constructed of small, lacquered metal plates held together by colored silk cords, this armor offered superior protection while maintaining surprising flexibility. Each piece of armor had a specific name and a particular function, from the dew that protected the torso to the tsunate that protected the shins. The samurai helmet, or kabuto, was a functional work of art, often decorated with elaborate ornaments and family crests. The face mask, or menpo, not only protected the face, but also intimidated enemies with fierce expressions carved into the metal. A samurai's full suit of armor could weigh between 45 and 55 pounds, but it was so well balanced that it allowed for agile movement and effective combat. The combat tactics employed by each group reflected their unique cultures and environments. The Vikings developed tactics that maximized their mobility and ability to inflict psychological impact. The berserker rage, though often exaggerated in legend, was a real tactic in which Viking warriors entered a state of controlled rage that rendered them seemingly immune to pain and fear. This psychological tactic often broke enemy morale before physical combat even began. The Viking shield wall formation was highly effective against cavalry charges and infantry attacks. Experienced warriors could maintain this formation as they advanced, creating an unstoppable force that crushed enemy resistance. Vikings were also masters of guerrilla warfare, using rapid attacks and strategic retreats to confuse and exhaust superior enemies. Samurai tactics were based on discipline, precision, and clever use of terrain. The samurai cavalry charge, with mounted archers firing arrows as they advanced, followed by spearmen and swordsmen, was a terrifying force on the battlefield. Samurai were trained to fight both individually and in formations, adapting their tactics to the specific circumstances of each battle. The concept of individual dueling was central to samurai culture. Before major battles, it was common for champions from each side to face each other in single combat, with the outcome influencing troop morale. This tradition of individual combat developed extraordinary personal fighting skills among the samurai, making them formidable opponents in any situation. When we consider combat mentality and psychology, we find profound differences that could decisively influence the outcome of a confrontation. The Viking mentality was fundamentally pragmatic. They fought for wealth, land, glory, and survival. This practical motivation created warriors who were highly adaptable and willing to seize any advantage available. Vikings did not hesitate to use tactics that others might consider dishonorable if it gave them a tactical advantage. Viking culture also emphasized the importance of luck and destiny. They believed that the Norns, the goddesses of fate, had already determined the moment of their death, so there was no reason to fear battle. This belief created warriors who fought with fierce abandon, not because they didn't value their lives, but because they believed an honorable death was preferable to a life of cowardice. The samurai mentality was shaped by the principles of Bushido and Zen Buddhist philosophy. Samurai were taught to accept death as a natural part of life and to fight without attachment to the outcome. This attitude, known as mushin or empty mind, allowed them to fight with complete concentration, without fear or hesitation. The concept of ichigo ichi, meaning one encounter, taught that each moment of combat was unique and should be lived fully. Samurai mental training included meditation, the study of philosophical texts, and practices designed to cultivate inner strength and equanimity. This mental preparation created warriors who were not only technically proficient, but also mentally unshakable. The ability to maintain calm and concentration under extreme pressure was one of the samurai's greatest strengths. Now let's examine specific combat scenarios to determine how these two types of warriors would fare in different situations in a single duel. Several variables would determine the outcome. If the combat took place in open terrain, with both warriors wearing their standard equipment, the samurai would have several significant advantages. Their superior armor would offer better protection, especially against slashing attacks. The katana, with its superior construction and advanced forging technique, could potentially cut through Viking chainmail with well-placed blows. The samurai's superior technical training in sword combat would also be a crucial advantage. Japanese fencing schools developed refined techniques over centuries, creating combat systems that maximize the effectiveness of each move. An experienced samurai could use techniques such as kiryotoshi, where a single strike cuts through the opponent's weapon and strikes them simultaneously, or tsuryage, where the attacker parries and counters in one fluid motion. However, the Viking would not be an easy opponent. His superior physical strength and experience in brutal combat could offset the samurai's technical advantages. Vikings were accustomed to fighting multiple opponents in chaotic conditions, developing a resilience and adaptability that could surprise a samurai accustomed to more formalized duels. The Viking sword, though less refined, was a brutal and effective weapon, especially when wielded by an experienced warrior. If the combat escalated into a prolonged fight, the Vikings' endurance and brute strength could become decisive factors. Vikings were conditioned for long, grueling combat. while the samurai fighting style emphasized technique and efficiency, often seeking to end the fight quickly with precise, lethal strikes. In group combat, the dynamics would change significantly. The Viking shield wall formation would be extremely effective against dismounted samurai, especially if the Vikings could maintain their formation. The Vikings' discipline and formation training would give them a substantial advantage in organized infantry combat. However, if the samurai had access to horses and archers, the situation would be very different. The mobility of the samurai cavalry and the accuracy of their mounted archers could break a Viking formation before it reached close combat. Samurai were masters at using terrain and mobility to offset numerical disadvantages, tactics that would be highly effective against the heavier Viking infantry. The element of surprise would also be crucial. Vikings were experts at surprise attacks and unconventional tactics. If they could catch samurai off guard or force them to fight in disadvantageous conditions, such as in confined spaces or during adverse weather conditions, the Vikings would have a significant advantage. The combat environment would be another determining factor. In a maritime environment, the Vikings would have an overwhelming advantage. Their experience in naval combat and ability to fight on moving ships would be unmatched. Samurai, being primarily a land-based force, would be at a severe disadvantage. In any engagement involving ships or water combat in mountainous or forested terrain, the samurai could have an advantage, especially if they had local knowledge. Their tactical ability and skill with bows could give them a decisive advantage. Vikings, accustomed to the more open terrain of Scandinavia, might have difficulty adapting to very different environments. Technological differences must also be considered. Japanese metallurgy was significantly more advanced than Scandinavian metallurgy, resulting in superior weapons and armor. However, the Vikings made up for this with tactical innovation and adaptability. They were quick to adopt new technologies and tactics from the peoples they encountered, while the samurai tended to be more conservative in their military approach. The question of leadership and command is also fascinating. Viking jarls were charismatic leaders who inspired loyalty through their personal exploits and generosity to their followers. They led from the front, sharing the same risks as their men. This approach created highly motivated and cohesive units. Samurai commanders, while also courageous, operated within a more rigid hierarchy based on hereditary status and feudal obligations. The structure provided superior discipline and organization, but could be less flexible in situations requiring rapid adaptation or individual initiative. We must also consider the factor of combat experience. Vikings spent most of their adult lives on expeditions that often involved combat. They faced a variety of different enemies, from other Vikings to Byzantine soldiers, Anglo-Saxon warriors, and Slavic tribes. This exposure to different fighting styles made them adaptable and experienced. Samurai, though highly trained, often experienced long periods of relative peace between conflicts. During the Edo period, many samurai never experienced actual combat, relying entirely on their theoretical training and practice with other samurai. However, during periods of active warfare, such as the Sengoku period, samurai were extremely experienced and effective warriors. Psychological motivation also differed significantly. Vikings fought for material gain, personal prestige, and loyalty to their jarl. This practical motivation made them fierce, but also pragmatic. They knew when to retreat if a battle was unwinnable. Samurai fought for honor, duty, and loyalty to their feudal lord. This motivation could drive them to fight to the death even in impossible situations, but it could also create tactical rigidity. Religious aspects also influenced combat. Norse religion emphasized the value of glorious death in battle, but also valued cunning and survival. Odin, the chief god, was known for both his wisdom and his willingness to use deception when necessary. This moral flexibility gave the Vikings the freedom to use any available tactic. The Buddhism and Shintoism that influenced the samurai emphasized different values. The Buddhist concept of impermanence taught that life was transitory, while Shintoism emphasized purity and honor. These influences created warriors who valued honorable death over survival. but they could also create inflexibility in situations that required unorthodox tactics. When we look at actual historical records of Norse-Japanese encounters, the data is limited but intriguing. The 1019 encounter I mentioned at the outset involved pirates that could have included Norse, but Japanese records are ambiguous about the exact identity of the invaders. However, the fact that they were repelled by Japanese defenders suggests that, at least in that specific instance, Japanese tactics and equipment were effective. We must also consider that both Vikings and samurai evolved over time. The Vikings of the 8th century were different from those of the 11th century, just as the samurai of the Heian period differed from those of the Kamakura period. Any comparison must specify which periods are being compared. If we compare Vikings at the height of their power, during the 9th and 10th centuries, with samurai of the Kamakura period in the 12th and 13th centuries, we would be comparing two of the most formidable warrior cultures in human history. Both groups would have specific advantages and disadvantages depending on the circumstances of the confrontation. The final analysis must consider that both Vikings and samurai were products of their specific societies and environments. Vikings developed tactics and equipment optimized for rapid raids, naval combat, and warfare in European terrain. Samurai evolved to dominate feudal Japanese warfare, with its own unique geographic and social conditions. In a purely technical analysis, considering only individual combat skill, equipment quality, and training, the average samurai would likely have an advantage over the average Viking. The katana's superiority over Viking weapons, more advanced armor, and more intensive and specific training would give the samurai several crucial advantages. However, in actual combat, many other factors would come into play. The Vikings' brutal combat experience, adaptability, physical strength, and willingness to use unconventional tactics could offset the samurai's technical advantages. Furthermore, Vikings were more accustomed to fighting enemies with different equipment and tactics than their own. The final outcome would depend greatly on the specific circumstances of the encounter. In a single duel under ideal conditions, an experienced samurai would likely defeat a Viking of equal skill. In group combat in open terrain, a well-commanded samurai force with cavalry and archers would likely defeat an equivalent Viking force. In naval combat or in chaotic, improvised conditions, the Vikings would have a substantial advantage. Perhaps the most important conclusion is that both Vikings and samurai represent the pinnacle of warrior excellence in their respective cultures and historical periods. Both developed highly effective combat systems tailored to their specific needs and unique environments. The question of who would win is fascinating to explore, but the real answer is that both were extraordinary warriors who dominated their respective worlds. Through a combination of skill, courage, discipline, and adaptability, comparing Vikings and samurai teaches us as much about the cultures that produced them as it does about the warrior classes themselves. Vikings emerged from a society that valued individual freedom, adventure, and pragmatism. Samurai were shaped by a culture that emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and technical perfection. Both approaches produced legendary warriors, but of very different types. In the end, perhaps the most interesting question isn't who would win, but what we can learn from these two extraordinary warrior traditions. Vikings teach us about adaptability, courage in the face of the unknown, and the importance of being pragmatic in the face of adversity. Samurai show us the value of discipline, meticulous preparation, and dedication to technical excellence. Both traditions hold relevant lessons for the modern world, where we face our own challenges that require both Viking adaptability and samurai discipline. Perhaps the true victory lies not in determining which warrior was superior, but in learning from both and applying those lessons to our own lives and challenges. The enduring fascination with Vikings and samurai in modern popular culture demonstrates that these historical figures continue to capture our imagination. They represent ideals of courage, skill, and dedication that transcend their specific eras. Whether through Viking adaptability or samurai discipline, these legendary warriors continue to inspire and teach, proving that some lessons are truly timeless. This in-depth exploration of two of history's most fascinating warrior cultures shows us that true strength comes not merely from superior weapons or better tactics, but from the combination of physical, mental, and spiritual preparation that transforms ordinary individuals into immortal legends. Vikings and samurai, each in their own way, achieved this transformation and, in doing so, earned a permanent place in human history.